Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, great to have your company. Welcome to the program. Well, it's done and dusted, isn't it? The Voice is behind us. And what a walloping for the Prime Minister, for division, for woke politics and so much more. We'll have all the analysis tonight. Here's what's coming up on Credlin. That emphatic decision on Saturday night. We'll get into all the implications it has for Aboriginal policy. The Prime Minister and Labor, given more than 40% of Labor's own vote, rejected the Prime Minister's plea. We won't forget the corporates or the sports stars either. This was a huge win for everyday Australians, fed up with being lectured to by the elites. So how can we build on it? Because one of the big things this referendum has demonstrated is if the coalition takes a principled position on an issue, they can bring the Australian public along with them. We'll see Peter Dutton on the program tonight and more. Also, that firebrand herself, Senator Nampijinpa Price. They've awakened a real warrior now, and defeating the Voice, well, that's just the start. She's now taking on the corruption at the heart of indigenous spending. Given taxpayers, you spend billions, and yet those on the ground don't see it. And Parliament, well, it returned today, and nowhere could the Prime Minister hide.
That the House condemns the Prime Minister for dividing Australians through his Voice referendum.
Why did he make no effort to achieve bipartisanship? Why did he waste $450 million of taxpayers' money?
Focused on his divisive Canberra Voice proposal rather than dealing with the surging cost of living pressures facing Australian families.
Is the Prime Minister committed to Makarrata truth-telling and treaty?
What I'm committed to post the referendum is respecting what Indigenous people have said. Makarrata is simply a Yolngu word for coming together after struggle. I think it's a good thing that people come together.
I will get into treaty because I'm telling you right now it is still on the table. But first, in voting no to the Prime Minister's Voice on Saturday, Australians voted yes to unity, yes to equality, and yes to our Constitution remaining colourblind. And their vote was emphatic. All states rejecting the Voice, even Victoria, even the electorate of Indigenous Affairs Minister Linda Burney. And in defying the big government, big business, big sport, union movement push, many of the faith leaders and multi-organisations too, and not forgetting big tech that control our social media, and in being unmoved by the saturation advertising, the moral pressure, well, the Australian public yet again demonstrated a steadiness and an ability to think for itself that I had started to worry we had lost. But it wasn't lost, or if it was, we found it again on Saturday night. And in rejecting Labor's divisive Voice, ordinary, everyday Australians found theirs. As Jacinta Nampijinpa Price said so beautifully on Saturday.
We are one of the, if not the greatest nation on the face of the earth. And it's time for Australians to believe that once again, to be proud, to call ourselves Australian.
If there's a loser from Saturday night, it was the Prime Minister, who will struggle to regain his authority after such a massive error of judgment. On a topic as sensitive as this, he should never have put forward such a divisive proposal. The fact that he did shows a lack of judgment about what's in our national interest and a lack of awareness about what people really think that will now haunt his Prime Ministership. It doesn't mean he won't win the next election, but it does make even a first-term government highly vulnerable, particularly if its efforts to tackle cost of living pressures continue to do more harm than good. But what this result shows us too is that the elites don't speak for all Australians, that their arrogant so-called progressive agenda of sneering at the suburbs, at people who live in our regions, that it's our way or the highway, is now over. As much as it was about the Voice, Saturday's vote was also a rejection of woke politics, of a national debate based on our identity and anything else that might divide us. And doesn't that rejection of woke feel good? The fact that the majority of Australians saw through The Voice, saw it as a vehicle of racial division, and against all odds rejected it, gives me enormous hope that we're not as far gone as a nation as some think we are, that we've got a potential to get things back on track on a whole raft of issues, like energy and other things, as well as Indigenous policy, that we're not too far gone to get back a sense of pride in Australia. So there are now two questions. The first, where to now for Indigenous policy? It was always a foolish line for the Yes campaign to claim that voting no was voting for the status quo or voting for nothing to change. Both Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine were adamant during the campaign that policy was failing on many fronts and that big change was needed. Senator Price said that the whole self-determination come separatist mindset was wrong because in practice it tended to condemn Aboriginal people to living in poor, isolated places. Warren Mundine said that the key to change was economic empowerment, getting kids to school and adults into work, not treating Aboriginal people as somehow different from everyone else. Boy, didn't he let a few of them know about this on Saturday night.
Where's about getting results, getting people reducing suicide, and instead of this nonsense that you people carry on with? It's about time. We had a vote tonight that said Australians want to get things done.
This result means that Voice Treaty Truth is dead, or it should mean that, and nowhere should the Prime Minister be allowed to continue his push for a Makarrata Treaty Commission when a majority of voters and a majority of states, all states, have so comprehensively rejected the first step, his voice.
Is the Prime Minister committed to Makarrata truth-telling and treaty?
What I'm committed to post the referendum is respecting what Indigenous people have said. Now, the voice was, with constitutional recognition, was important. Makarrata is simply a Yolngu word for coming together after struggle. I think it's a good thing that people come together, and I made that very clear on Saturday night that that is my position.
Real pressure has to come on the Prime Minister now to dump the Makarrata Commission, to dump the Treaty Commission. And if he won't back down and take the Treaty Commission off the table, then Peter Dutton and the Coalition, well, they've got to take it to the election, make the Albanese Treaty a big election issue. And the second question, well, what does it all mean now for Australia, given the obvious voting gulf between the richer, lefter, greener parts of the country and everyone else? Well, as a start, it should force a reappraisal from all the yes advocacy groups, like the big corporates and the sporting bodies, who leapt onto a political bandwagon, presumably because they thought it couldn't lose. How could they have been so out of touch? And there are big questions too for both political parties. Outside its green left inner city seats, the Labor Party was humiliated. Humiliated as it should have been, as it deserved to be, given that this was always about voice, treaty and truth. The Uluru Agenda in full, designed to divide us on the basis of how long some of our ancestors have been here, spending even more on reparations despite the billions that are wasted already, and retelling our Australian history as a story of shame. Now, none of this was ever going to appeal to the decent Australians who usually vote Labor, who wonder why the Workers' Party now seems to worry about everything else except their own well-being at a time when they're really doing it tough. And given that Peter Dutton now looks like a winner from taking a stand on principle and arguing it through, the Liberals have got to ask, why have they been so reluctant to have a fight on anything since 2015 when Malcolm Turnbull staged his takeover of the party? When Scott Morrison rolled over on net zero, that was a massive own goal. Looking at the results on Saturday night and the circumstances we're seeing now overseas, where much of the world is rethinking their green agenda, that also must wake up the Liberal Party. And sure, the ex-Liberal Teal seats seem to have voted yes, but that just shows how out of sync the Teal seats are with the rest of Australia. So the Libs who angst about winning them back and who want to upend policies to get them on side, well, they risk losing everywhere else just to chase those Teals. And given the way the academic and business establishment lined up in favour of yes, only to be rejected at the polls, the weekend's vote was akin to Australia's own Brexit moment. Only there, unlike here, the Prime Minister at least had the decency to resign after the side he backed was rejected. Let's hope now that Australians have roared that Canberra will listen. And we use this moment in history to reset the way we see ourselves as a country. No more rewriting our history as a story of shame. No more moves to separatism and racial division. Yes to unity. Yes to Aboriginal people with a seat at the table like Jacinta Price. And no to condemning them as the other, doomed to live indefinitely in a world of grievance and victimhood.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. And when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Thank you, Australia. Thank you. All right, let's get the headlines now. Sky News political reporter Olivia Casely.
Peter Dutton has walked back his offer to hold a second referendum on indigenous recognition in the Constitution after the Voice's defeat.
The Australian public is probably over the referendum process for some time.
He gave a solemn promise that he would support a second referendum being held.
But the opposition leader still wants an audit of spending on Aboriginal people. It follows a resounding defeat for the Yes campaign on Saturday as Australians rejected a voice to Parliament. In the wash-up, attention is turning to how to close the gap and heal the national divide.
As government, we have a responsibility to write the next chapter as well. A chapter that sees the gap closing.
Australians are questioning the competence of this Prime Minister. Energy policy is a disaster with power prices going up and up. The $450 million referendum was against advice and resulted in our country being divided.
Cabinet will meet to discuss the government's next steps to address Indigenous disadvantage. Australians who wish to leave Israel are being asked to board a repatriation flight today, as it may be their last available opportunity for the foreseeable future. Hundreds of Australians who've fled Israel on government-assisted flights have expressed relief. 1,200 Australians have left Tel Aviv since the conflict began.
Overnight we had around 250 Australians who were able to leave Tel Aviv for Dubai on 3 flights, 2 RAF RAAF flights and 1 charter.
Residents in Lebanon are also being asked to assess whether their presence in the country is necessary over fears of a spillover in the conflict. Anthony Albanese has condemned Hamas's attack on Israel, calling the terror group the enemy of all peace-loving Palestinians.
One of the many tragic consequences of Hamas's abhorrent attack is that it has pushed that two-state solution further out of reach.
He's also announced $10 million in extra funding for improving security around places of worship.
All right, let's get an update now where the count stands tonight. We've had some takeaways too on that very decisive wall-to-wall no vote. Sky News election analyst Tom Connell with the latest.
The simplest rule of thumb in this referendum, the further you live away from a capital city, the more likely you'll vote no, and in high numbers as well. So let's take a look at New South Wales. 60% for no, starting off in the regional areas, the furthest out from Sydney. Some Labor electorates here were won in the 2022 election, but no yes electorates. This is a wall of no in this referendum. Okay, so let's get a little bit closer in. The surrounds here, including the New South Wales coast, a lot of Labor red here at the last election in this referendum. The two ones here, the two yes examples, they're essentially the two city centres in this area. They've voted yes, the rest are all no. So this is telling, this is continuing this pattern. Then we get a little bit closer. Let's go to the southeast. So here's Sydney. Here's where we're looking at in these particular electorates. A lot of Labor ones, in particular, closer to Sydney, so that the urban fringes, if you like, how they voted, almost all no except for Kingswood Smith. So again, a lot of territory here. The yes camp would have wanted to be winning, and they haven't. Then we get into the friendliest sort of areas, if you like, the inner sort of Sydney and also the west as well. So we've got the teal seats here, obviously. We've got inner city, then we've got the west. And you can see here at the referendum, they've held up better. They've got a wall of yes, but then it hits no as soon as you get to those suburbs. So that trend has been pretty obvious. Then we get to Victoria. Let's have a look, because we've got a similar situation in Victoria. Regional, fewer seats, a much smaller state geographically, and these are not going to be friendly, you'd think, to Labor. No, so they're all no electorates this time around. We get a little bit closer in though, Melbourne surround. So we're seeing a lot of Labor suburbs in sort of some of these population centres, Bendigo, Ballarat, with some Liberal. How have they voted this time around? How many can the Yes campaign get? None of them. Not a single electorate in these clusters around the Melbourne area. So that already tells you they're well and truly behind the eight ball on that. Then we get a little bit closer. Let's go to the north and west. Again, this is all Labor now, not a single Liberal or national electorate from the last federal election. How are they voting? You can see it's getting better. At least they've got some yes representation, but still two they've missed out on. And the telling thing as well within that, let's just pop in quickly to the seat of Scullin. And the issue is, it's not that they've just lost it, 62.9% have voted no. So that tells you there's a lot of ground to make up when we get closer to the city. And let's do that right now. So when we go to the east and south, you're talking Melbourne City here, a green seat, couple of teal seats, Kooyong and Goldstein. Then we're getting a bit further out to the suburbs. So this has to be a wall of green if the yes case is going to win. As you can see, it's a slither. There's plenty of seats in there, but there's also plenty that have ended up voting no. And the other issue within all of that is some of the margins there. So we've seen some huge margins, 75, 80% in a lot of these regional areas. When we look across the nation now, Victoria is the best yes state at 45%. You can see all the others now have a 6 in front of them, a real show of the strength of the no vote across the country.
Thanks, Tom. Almost 80% there of the national vote counted. What's it all mean? Well, here's the Australian's national editor, Dennis Shanahan. We've just seen that breakdown. Even in the state of Victoria, I couldn't believe that when that came in on Saturday night as a no state. Emphatic rejection. I keep using that word. I don't think I can get a better word. An emphatic rejection of the PM's constitutional voice to the Parliament. What are the political implications here, Dennis?
Oh, well, of course, the vote is a disaster for Anthony Albanese. It is well beyond what people expected. It's certainly not what he expected. It's now worse than the Republican vote and looks to be even worse than the preamble vote in 1999. So this is a record low vote for a referendum, and the architect of it was Anthony Albanese. He promised it at the moment he was elected, and from there on has campaigned for it. He told Aboriginal leaders they could have what they wanted. He gave it to them. He gave no compromise. He gave no conciliation. He gave no real attempt to get bipartisan support. At no stage did he say to the Aboriginal leadership, look, I don't think we can get this up, because he believed he could, and he believed he could do it on the vibe. So what we've actually seen is now the electorate overwhelmingly reject it, basically because of a lack of detail. This was another decision by Anthony Albanese. On Saturday night, Anthony Albanese said he took responsibility. Well, he did have to take responsibility. He had no choice. Today, on the first sitting after, he's attempted to shift the blame. He's trying to suggest that, Peter Dutton's really at fault. Now, I don't think there's any immediate fallout for Anthony Albanese in terms of a challenge, but it has damaged his credibility. It's damaged his judgment. It means he's out of touch with the Australian public, and this will be something that his colleagues will look at over the coming months into next year. And if there's anything else, any other big policy he makes a mistake on, then that will be doubled down. Not only that, the big danger for him is if yes campaigners, as they already have, start to blame him for the failure and not take the blame themselves. This is Anthony Albanese's referendum. It's his result.
He tried, though, on Saturday night, and it's been the sort of the script for the last couple of days, to try and make this about Peter Dutton and a lack of bipartisanship. But you don't get bipartisanship by saying, this is my idea, take it or leave it. That's not what bipartisanship is. And, of course, that's what the PM offered. He wouldn't move an inch on any of this. A whole lot of captain's calls here. He's continuing them today, Dennis. He was in the Parliament today backing in Makarrata, says that the Treaty Commission is still on the table. Now, after a vote like that on The Voice, what do you reckon the numbers would be if the Australian public was voting on a Treaty Commission? That's also got to concern his colleagues, because he has no licence for this from the voter.
None at all. And these are questions which will continue to be asked by the coalition, because as far as the Makarrata Commission is concerned, there's already been $1 million spent, and we don't know what it was for. Before the referendum, Linda Burney said, "Oh, we'll let you know after," and there's been $26 million allocated to the Commission. $26 million taken out of the budget, allocated. Almost $1 million already spent, and we don't know what it was for. Now, these are things that the government is going to have to respond to. Now, the Prime Minister suggested there might be a bit of a review on this. They should. They should do a real review. And then that opens the whole issue that Jacinta Price and Peter Dutton have raised about an audit of all of the existing spending. Even the Prime Minister said on Saturday night that people who voted no were not actually voting for status quo. He changed his message, but at least he admitted it, that people who were voting no want things done for Indigenous Australia, and this is where the test is going to have to be. It's going to have to be done without The Voice, which wasn't the only answer, and the government is going to have to be held to account on what it does now, and the Makarrata Commission is one of them, with a $26 million price tag.
I made some comments at the top of the show there also too. Yes, it was about The Voice. I'm not distracting that vote away from the Voice question, but it had, I think, a lot of implications for woke, for people being sneered at by elites. I think corporate Australia, Dennis, has got to have a really hard look at itself, sporting codes as well. All of that's wrapped up into it. But, of course, today in the Parliament, when they returned, Israel was top of mind for condolence motions for debate. But interestingly, Tony Burke, who I had heavily criticised last week for failing to call out that imam who was out there on the Sunday night after the massacres, spewing his hate everywhere. Well, Tony Burke said he was not well. He blamed his health issues for his failure to call him out. Have a listen.
A few people, not many, are aware of the state of my health last week, which meant my public commentary was very limited, and when comments were eventually given to the media late in the week, they were not published. So allow me to take this chance to be quite unequivocal. Statements of hate speech, some of which were given in my part of Sydney, some of which were given elsewhere, are all unacceptable and are all to be condemned. There is no place for hate speech in Australia.
And then you add in the Greens today, Dennis, and Kyla Ting, Sophie Scamps, and the Tasmanian Independent Andrew Wilkie all supporting a motion today in the Parliament condemning Israel. I mean, I think this is extraordinary.
It was a bizarre situation. We had a bipartisan position supported by the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, the Leader of the National Party, and many independents, and they were moving a motion supporting Israel, offering condolences to the victims, and also calling for further peace in Israel, as the Prime Minister himself made clear. The actions, these horrific actions by Hamas, unprovoked attack on Israeli people, have put the two-state solution further away. And yet the Greens and two Teal independents and Andrew Wilkie from Tasmania extraordinarily supported a motion to condemn Israel and accuse it of war crimes in its defence. This was extraordinary. We actually saw the position where at one stage the House separated and there were more than 130 MPs, Nationals, Independents, Liberals, Labor, all on one side, and four Green MPs on the other, supporting an amendment which was crushed despite the support from the members of North Sydney and Mackellar in Sydney. It was defeated properly, and yet we had this bizarre marring of what should have been a unanimous condemnation of the Hamas terror attacks and support for Israel.
I tell you, if you live in those seats of North Sydney and Mackellar, Tink and Scamps are your local MPs. That should be out there on call flutes between now and the polling day coming up when the federal election's next held, because that is reprehensible behaviour for any MP. Thank you, Dennis. It's been a big few months, certainly a big weekend for the referendum. Thank you again for your analysis. Right after the break, Opposition Leader Peter Dutton, Uluru Statement in full, says Labor, including a treaty process. What says Dutton? After that too, Jacinta Nampijinpa Price. She's done with The Voice. She's moving on to something else. She'll tell you what after the break. Well, welcome back. Shortly I'll be joined by the woman who, through this referendum, has truly shifted the discussion when it comes to Indigenous Australians. Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa Price joining me shortly. But first, to the Leader of the Opposition, Peter Dutton, who joins us from Canberra. Peter Dutton, welcome. John Howard, he took a proposal to recognise Aboriginal people in the preamble to the Constitution back in 1999. Now, that referendum then failed to get any more than 40% of the vote. It got no one state to support it either. 24 years on, Prime Minister Albanese's attempt on the weekend, well, that has failed by a similar margin. And again, not one state supported it. Now, The Voice was a whole lot more than just recognition in the Constitution. I think we can agree on that. But doesn't this say that Australians don't support this push at all?
Well, Peter, I think the Australian public's delivered a very clear verdict, and I think the Prime Minister should listen to that. He apologised in question time today, and obviously he's been completely and utterly focused on The Voice over the course of the last 17 months, and I think a lot of Australians are hurting because of it. They've made decisions economically in two budgets that have driven up the cost of living, so a lot of Australians are very angry about that element of it. To your point, I think in part the message out of the weekend was, one, that Australians aren't opposed to helping Indigenous Australians. I think most Australians instinctively want to make sure that money is being spent effectively and that the programs are being of benefit to people on the ground. Secondly, I don't think they voted against recognition. There's a lot of support for recognition. I think they voted absolutely against The Voice. The Prime Minister took a deliberate decision, unfortunately, from his perspective, not to explain the detail, and I think Australians voted it down, and I just don't think he's across the detail. I think it's sloppy. I think there's an air of incompetence sneaking into, creeping into this government, and I think that's the message that we got out of the weekend.
Yeah, but John Howard's motion in 1999, its referendum then, there was no mention of a voice. It failed by a similar margin. This one's failed. you currently have on the table the idea that at the next election, if you're elected Prime Minister, you're going to put the same sort of question on recognition, to the Australian people. Is that going to change out of the result on Saturday night?
There is a policy that we've taken to each election, including the last election, which said that we wanted to recognise Indigenous Australians. Now, I've also been very clear that we don't proceed with that until we know that there is support, bipartisan support from Indigenous leaders. And I think, to be honest, there's fatigue well and truly for referendum. So I don't think there's anything in the near term, but I do think as a policy, it's important to point out we've taken it to subsequent elections. We took it to the last election. It remains our policy. But I make this important point. As I announced on Saturday night, Jacinta and Karen will lead a process for us to review our policies, to call out the rorts and rip-offs within some of the programs, money that's not being spent where it should.
All right, the Prime Minister said the first statement he really made after he won the election was that he was committed to the Uluru Statement in full. I know the Deputy Prime Minister, Richard Marles, has said that hasn't changed. That's still Labor's view. So voice, treaty, truth. Here's the Prime Minister on the question of a treaty today in Question Time.
Is the Prime Minister committed to Makarrata, truth-telling and treaty?
What I'm committed to post the referendum is respecting what Indigenous people have said. Now, the voice was with constitutional recognition was important. Makarrata is simply a Yolngu word for coming together after struggle. I think it's a good thing that people come together, and I made that very clear on Saturday night that is my position.
Well, Peter Dutton, just like the voice was a lot more than recognition, Makarrata is a lot more than just coming together. Surely the PM has got to call this dead now.
Well, I mean, surely he does. He committed 34 times to the Uluru Statement in full. He made it clear to the Australian public that that's what he had in mind. Voice was the first step. Now, I mean, you raised the issue of questions asked and answers given. I think the Australian public gave a pretty clear answer to the question on Saturday, whether they supported voice, treaty, truth-telling, Makarrata. I think the Prime Minister would be pretty keen to reject the Australian public's view from the weekend. The treaty talks about a process that can go on for a couple of decades at a cost of literally billions of dollars. The reparations, which is a significant part of what we're talking about as well, I mean, potentially tens of billions of dollars. You've seen the truth-telling, the treaty stuff in Queensland. The Premier there is talking about literally hundreds of millions of dollars just in relation to one element of it, and it's not even started yet. So if that's the case just in Queensland, multiply that across the Commonwealth over decades, you may well be talking about tens of billions of dollars. And the Prime Minister couldn't rule it out. In fact, he just couldn't give a straight answer today. Now, this is going to cause him grief because he's given a private and a public commitment to Marcia Langton and Noel Pearson and others that he will commit to the Uluru Statement in full. And I think this is why many of the Indigenous leaders are angry at the Prime Minister at the moment, because he says different things in different forums. He says one thing in a meeting and gets outside, does a press conference, says the opposite. So I think a lot of Indigenous leaders will be saying, hang on, you signed up to the whole thing and now you're walking away from it.
What about voices per se? You know, there was talk on your side of politics that there'd be some open door to local or regional voices or perhaps legislated voices, as has been talked about in the past. I mean, given the emphatic result on Saturday night, are you going to put that whole question of a coalition-supported voice of some sort into your review, and are you prepared to look at that again?
Well, it's all in for review, but my view is that the Australian public's been very clear, particularly in relation to, obviously, a voice enshrined in the Constitution. Now, if the Prime Minister wants to go to the next election seeking a mandate for Makarrata, for truth-telling, for everything else that goes with it at the cost of tens of billions of dollars, then that'll be a decision he'll have to make. Whether he proposes to put the voice into legislation let's wait and see. It wasn't a recommendation of the Carmel Langton report, as we know, but the Prime Minister took that position after he, I think, cowered in the advice of the referendum working group. I think the Prime Minister's trying to please everybody here, just telling different people different things. At some stage, he's got to reconcile the commitments that he's given to the referendum working group, to Noel Pearson and Marcia Langton and Thomas Mayo and others on the one hand, and the Australian people on the other.
Is this an end to the injustice politics, the hatred of Australia Day, the colonisation arguments and all of that? Have we drawn a line in the sand, given that result, that emphatic result on Saturday night? And are we now looking in a more focused way, given the billions we spend, is it getting to where it's needed most? And if not, why not? Who is benefiting then from the billions that clearly women and children in particular remote communities are not seeing?
Well, I certainly hope it is, and I think when you listen to Jacinta Price, she speaks common sense, she can communicate with Australians, and having moved right around the country through Indigenous communities and in capital cities, regional areas, particularly over the course of the last 17 months, I believe the vast majority of Australians are of Jacinta's view and her outlook and perspective. If we just say that there's nothing to see here, the programs are being adequately funded, there's no suggestion of money being diverted away from where it's most needed on the ground, we just condemn ourselves to the same failure of recent years. And if we want to close the gap, as the Prime Minister says, and as we all desire, if we want those educational and health outcomes improved, then we have to start thinking differently. And I think Jacinta can lead the national debate in relation to that. And certainly if we win the next election, Jacinta will be my Minister for Indigenous Australians. And I think that will give our country the best hope of improving the lives of particularly those kids and women who at the moment are suffering because of domestic violence and sexual assaults. We want a better situation for them, and I think it's only Jacinta Price that can deliver that.
Peter Dutton, it's easy to take the tough decisions when they're popular. It's very hard to take them when they're not popular, and that's where I think this debate was, when you took the principled decision to oppose the Voice for the reasons now we've all ventilated over the last few weeks. So congratulations to you for your principled and conviction stand. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Pleasure. Thanks so much, Peter. Thank you.
All right, let's go now to the Bodicea of the No campaign, Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians, Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa Price. Well, Jacinta, you had on your shoulders all Australians who wanted equality and a colourblind constitution to continue. On Saturday night, what was clear in that result, I reckon, was that we're all sick of being told that we've got to hate our country, be ashamed about our history. You say we've had a sorry day, we've had the apology. When is Forgiveness Day? Well, I reckon Forgiveness Day is Saturday, the 14th of October. And we now use that huge vote for our country to turn a page.
Look, I couldn't agree more, Peter. You know, Australia, I think, has sighed a sigh of relief in understanding that, you know what, it's okay to be proud to be Australian and to move forward knowing that actually the vast majority of us wants what's best for all of us, particularly our most marginalised. I would say, though, that I know a wonderful bloke by the name of Danny Abdallah. He and his wife Layla are pushing for a Forgiveness Day, which I think is in early February. I had a wonderful conversation with him just this morning, in fact, about the whole idea of forgiveness in our country, and I'm very happy to join their campaign to establish a day of forgiveness for everybody, for all Australians across for many different various issues. But certainly I think that is about finalising that circle of healing. You know, here's a man and he and his wife have been through a tremendous, you know, overcome a tremendous tragedy in their lives and forgiven the man that took the lives of their children. And if somebody like that, if those two incredible Australians can do that, and that is something that is open for all Australians to move forward with. It's about freeing oneself, it's about healing oneself and moving forward, and I think it's, you know, a wonderful idea.
You know, I reckon part of the reason why the Aboriginal elites were so scared of you through all that personal abuse at you, Jacinta, is that you risk exposing that whole Aboriginal industry and their role in failing to close the gap. You know, for all the organisations that they run, for all the money they have to spend, we know that money's not hitting the ground where it's needed, which begs the question, if the money's not there on the ground but the money's leaving Canberra, something's happening there in the middle, right? There's clearly issues of corruption and other things that need investigation. Peter Dutton says you are going to get into this issue now that the Voice has been resolved. Tell us more.
Look, absolutely. Myself and my wonderful colleague, Senator Karen Little, we will be pursuing, an inquiry into where that money is being spent. This government cannot ignore the calls now. When Australia voted no over the weekend, they actually also voted for these calls for inquiries into where the money is being spent. It's not just governments that have been responsible for the failures in terms of closing the gaps, but for those that have been funded to create outcomes to improve the lives of our most marginalised, they are also responsible. And of course, there are many organisations that came out as strong yes supporters because of they want an entity in the Constitution that they can rely upon to do their bidding. But now, they have to understand that there are Indigenous women in Parliament who are prepared to ask the tough questions, and they need to be answered for the benefit of our marginalised. When the government suggests that the ANAO are doing their job in terms of auditing, no, we want an inquiry so we can hear from those marginalised Indigenous Australians who are affected by the lack of outcomes. And that's the purpose of these inquiries, to use the structures that exist to give those people a voice.
What's your reaction to those Aboriginal leaders, those yes proponents who are refusing to speak to the media this week, having announced on Saturday night this official week of mourning, the demand that all Aboriginal flags fly at half-mast, given they lost the vote?
Look, I think people need to do some reflection as to, not, I guess, wanting to front up an understanding that along with those Australians that voted no are a lot of Indigenous Australians that voted no, that everyone has responsibility in this, including those organisations. And there's like almost a doubling down from the ABC to suggest that the No campaign only won because of misinformation and various other ridiculous accusations, not accepting the fact that the Australian people saw through this detailless proposal and the misleading claims that were being made, that the majority of Indigenous Australians supported it, that it was just an advisory body, and various other claims that we as the No campaign called out along the way. And I think they need to respect that. The majority, we live in a democracy, the majority has determined the outcome, and that needs to be respected going forward.
Jacinta Nampijinpa Price, I don't think I could imagine this result, this outcome, without you in that role at the helm. That decision that you took to do the job asked of you by Peter Dutton, I think saved Australia. So thank you for your time tonight. All right, coming up, top ABC journalist, ABC board member too, Laura Tingle. She says she wishes the ABC didn't give balanced coverage on The Voice, saying it forced the broadcaster to give a platform to people like Senator Price. Plus, Labor blames the No vote on misinformation and disinformation as they announced it's still committed to the Uluru Statement in full. Welcome back. You would have thought the very journalists at the ABC who want balance would have been happy enough to have balance during a debate as important as a referendum, but not so. A high-profile ABC journalist, board member Laura Tingle, says the obsession with balance degraded their coverage of The Voice, and she singled out Jacinta Nampijinpa Price for a particular mention. Joining me now, my panel on a Monday, as always, former Resources Minister, LNP member for Hinckley, of course that's Keith Pitt, and former Howard Government Minister Gary Hardgrave. Gents, I'll start with you, Gary.
Hey, Peter.
Tinkle's just not a high-profile journo with a big microphone. I mean, she's on the board of the ABC.
Yeah, Peter, the problem is that they think they're morally and intellectually superior to the rest of us. You know, a lot of people who filed through polling booths on Saturday felt exactly that as well. I stood on a couple of those booths and watched it all happen closely, and being accused of being part of misleading and lying and all this sort of stuff. And don't you know? And I said, well, the Prime Minister doesn't even know. How do you know? I mean, they honestly think they are morally and intellectually superior to us. And this is the woke brigade. And Laura Tingle is a perfect example of that. The ABC is broken. It's completely broken. I don't watch it. I don't listen to it. I pay my, $3 a day or whatever it now costs. And one thing's for sure, they heavily invested in trying to change Australia for the worst. And they need to be brought back. You turn them into a subscription service, Peter, we'll check to see how many people really want them, because I won't subscribe to them. I'll take on Sky, Netflix and Paramount and all of these other things, but I will not take on the ABC because, frankly, apart from Bluey, there's nothing worth watching.
Keith, surely after Saturday night, no council, no state government, no one's got a right now to try and cancel Australia Day or our flag or anything else by stealth. I mean, the Australian people, they couldn't have been clearer.
It is an overwhelming and resounding result and a defeat for the proposition. But I'll guarantee you, Peter, they'll be straight back out there. They'll have their flags at half-mast. They'll be doing all the things that the Australian people dislike. They haven't listened to the Australian people. You look at the discussion that's been happening now. Oh, it's not right. There's misinformation. It's not misinformation. They've made a decision based on what they knew, and it has been a strong one.
Yep.
And I think the Australian people have got this absolutely right. They are sick of it. No more welcome to countries at every event, printed on T-shirts and beer coasters and everything else. They just want Australians to be Australians. They love their country. And what's wrong with being patriotic?
Yeah.
And what about all these state government treaties? I know the LNP in Queensland, they support one. The Liberal Party in Victoria,
not all of them.
They support one. What do you reckon, Gary?
Well, look, Peter, 70% of Queenslanders voted very clearly that they do not want race to be a factor in the way government runs things. You know, if people need help, regardless of whether they're black, white, brindle or whatever colour, I mean, it doesn't matter. If you need help, you get help. And the idea of I think it's a pathway to a treaty tax. That's really what Anastasia Palaszczuk is proposing, because they're talking about bringing in tolls and taxes for people as they live on, work on, farm on, mine on, or travel through land that is held in the names of traditional owners. That's what they're talking about. That's where this thing leads to. I do not understand how any Queensland government now or in the future could honestly say they're in favour of new taxes built around treaty, but that's what it is. It's a pathway to treaty tax. That's what it's about, Peter, and it's got to be called out as such, and Palaszczuk has got to tell us how much it's going to cost us to meet, as Peter Dutton rightly said earlier, hundreds and hundreds of millions, tens of billions over somebody's lifetime. That's the sort of rubbish we're facing. This is not good enough. Just not good enough.
Keith, I know most Australians look at those pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas rallies over the last couple of days, and of course the horrible scenes last week with a lot of revulsion. We've got, though, the ABC, the BBC, very weak on this issue. Even an ABC journalist denying that babies were decapitated and murdered. This soft stance on Hamas also spilled over in the Parliament today. You've got two of those teals sitting over there with the Greens condemning Israel when Israel should have the support of the world.
Absolutely, Peter. And I saw that footage out of Sydney, and I did a double take because I actually thought it was in another country. That's not the Australia I know. That's not the people I know of this country and their views. I was absolutely, firstly, outraged, and secondly, astounded that it was allowed to go on like it did. They've got this absolutely wrong, the ABC. And as you said, you've got a Middle East correspondent who's allegedly said that the beheading of infants is BS. Well, you should just admit when you get those things wrong. The US president says that it happened, and I think they've got pretty good sources of intelligence. But the bottom line here is pro-Israel, pro-Palestine. How about we just be anti-terrorists? These are people, weak men with guns who have murdered the innocent. And that is exactly what it is, and we should call it out, and we should defend our nation's right to have those views. And I think nearly every Australian is appalled by what they're seeing across the country. Who would have thought in this nation that you would have school kids who are scared to wear their uniform to school because it's a Jewish school? That is outrageous. If you come here, leave your baggage behind, and if these individuals are here on a visa, well, they should be rescinded and they can go.
I got to go, gents, but I could not agree more. Andrew Bolt's up next. Keith, thank you as always. Gary, see you back tomorrow night here at 6.